What I'm going to do here is take all of Sanger's topics and tell a different story with it. So ideology is interesting because it's a term that economists use a lot, and still it's really difficult to define. So what I'm going to do here is not spending 10 minutes to try to define objectivity with sort of fancy terms. I'm just going to emphasize one aspect. Ideology is a characteristic of the research of the research of other economists you disagree with or you distrust, but it's never a characteristic of your own research. Yeah, we're serious people. We don't do ideological research, right? So let me give you some example of how economists use the word ideology. This is an example for Paul Krugman, in which he says about a survey. Most of economists are doing research that is fairly objective, but not business cycle microeconomists, right? They're doing ideological research. He's also discussing those economists who, after the crisis, disagree about the stimulus idea. And he would say, people like Eugene Fama or Gary Becker, they oppose the stimulus, and in the end, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that all of them have decided on political ground that they don't want a spending-based fiscal stimulus. Another example, of course, is when Paul Romer, this year's Nobel Prize, argued very straightforwardly, explicitly a few years ago, that for some economists, the use of math lets academic politics masquerade as science. And I'm going to end up with an example from last week. There's been Danny Roderick, Suresh Naidu, and Gabriel Zuckman who launched a new initiative for economists for inclusive growth and prosperity. And in their blueprints document, they actually say large parts of mainstream economics is actually ideology, is actually neoliberalism, but not all of them. I mean, the kind of research they do that is heavily empirical, actually use empirical evidence as a disciplining device against ideology. Okay, so what do we get from that? The way when an economist curses another economist's research for being ideological, what does he or she means? Two things. Oh, that's really weird. The first one is that ideological research is research that lacks objectivity in the sense that it's normative. Like it says, well, you are discussing what ought to be, while you should be discussing what is, or you are discussing the end of the policy, while you should be discussing the means. And we know, since Lionel Robbins, that this is bad. So initially, I thought the purpose of that talk, I could try to convince you that no matter how hard you try, you're not going to escape the normative aspects of economics. I mean, when you use equilibrium, when you use rationality, when you use utility, when you use Pareto notion of Pareto optimum or social welfare function, it carries all these devices and all these terms, they carry normative implication. They carry normative vision about how society is and how it should be and what is good and whatsoever. But then I thought, I mean, people in that room, they already thought about this question. If you're there, you already know about the normative implications of economics, and you sort of own it. Maybe you even agree with these two researchers. These are urban economics writing in the 60s and saying the authors do not believe in Lionel Robbins. But then ideology can also mean lack of objectivity, but as subjectivity. If I say your research is ideological, I can mean it's subjective in the sense that you smuggle your own private values in your research and that it influences your data, your theory, your conclusions, right? So you might be willing to take that criticism as well, saying, yeah, in some sense, all economic research is subjective. The problem is that it comes usually with another assumption, that is intentionality. When you actually argue that someone's research is ideological, what you often say is that person, on purpose, smuggle values to sort of tweak his or her conclusion to fit some priors or to fit what clients want. Here are two examples. I mean, one economist is accusing another very famous economist of cherry-picking data. And here, some economists are being accused of arguing that there is no problem with some competition because they are actually paid by the firm. Like, you can argue that Facebook buying WhatsApp is not going to harm consumer because you're being paid by Facebook. Or you're going to argue that you don't need to regulate derivative market because you're being paid by Goldman Sachs. This kind of accusation. Okay. Now I'm going to argue there are two problems with linking ideology with intentionality. One first issue is sort of kind of chicken and egg problem. As a historian, I know that it's really difficult to document ideological bias in research. Of course, there are people who like money. Of course, there are economists who have strong views. But is it that they have this research because they are paid for it? Or are they paid for it because in advance, their research led to this conclusion? It's really difficult to conclude. And the other problem with linking ideology with intentionality is that it sort of shields each of you from having to inquire about the ideology in your own research. Because you're people with good intention. And if you're in this room, it's because you're looking for the truth, and you're looking behind the smoke screen. So, of course, you have good intention. You don't have any ideology. So here's my very small proposal for this evening, just one idea. How about thinking about ideology as the collective aggregate consequences of modeling decisions that were made for completely different purposes? I'm just going to give you one example. One thing that economists look into, they want models that are tractable. Tractable just mean model that can be solved. So it looks like completely tautological. Of course, you want to write model that can be solved. But the thing is, what is a solution and what is a good solution has changed a lot over time. For a long time, for an economist, writing a model that you can solve actually means solving it analytically with pen and pencil, okay? And because you need that, economists were led to do all sorts of simplifying assumptions. You choose to model a representative agent because heterogeneity is just, you can solve the model. Or you have linear types of constraint, or you have an Euler equation, or you assume money away, or you assume the financial market away, okay? Just because the model is tractable. You have an example here. It's the famous paper by Lucas and Sargent that is called After Keynesian Macroeconomics. And you can see this is exactly what they're arguing. There is no theoretical reason to have linear model other than tractability, okay? And what is usually argued is it's just temporary. We're waiting for better computational resource, or we're waiting for better techniques, but in the meantime, we're just going to simplify, okay? And this, it doesn't really matter whether you believe they have their hypothesis for ideological or tractable reason. What happens next matter. What happens next is that you train your graduate student, and then into writing that sort of tractable models, and then your colleagues, and then the referees, and then the editors. And at some point, you want other type of tractability. You want to estimate models, so you have empirical tractability. And now that we're developing new concepts of solution, like numerical approximation, you also want models that are computationally tractable. But tractability is still there, okay? And at some point, what happens is that all these assumptions that were meant to be temporary, they became entrenched in the profession. You forget that you made them for tractability and that they were meant to be temporary. And what you end up with 20 years later, although you made none of these modeling choices for ideological reason, when you aggregate over them, you end up with a professional consensus that is a set of models that cannot see the distributional consequences of some policies because it's not in the models, or financial imbalance, or inequality. In other words, the consensus, the aggregate consensus, sort of becomes ideological, right? So I'm sure some of you in the room might say, oh yeah, she's talking about that style of doing economics that is about modeling, and in particular, mathematical modeling. That's the example I show you. What I want to say is, it goes beyond that. I'm a historian of economics, and my job is to work with qualitative data to tell stories, and I can tell you it's the same. We also want tractable stories in the sense that we want to abstract or to take from the mess and the noise and the complexity some very clear aspect to explain the world. And I can tell you that in history, in sociology, in qualitative sociology, or in philosophy, there are also tractability issues. There are also styles of reasoning that become entrenched and that becomes dominant, right? So, to conclude, what can be the solution to that? To the solution to sets of decisions that are being made for tractability purpose, that over time, and when many economists do the same decision, that becomes sort of ideological. The result, the collective result, sort of ideological. Of course, one solution is awareness, it's reflexivity, and I want to conclude by emphasizing that it's exactly what ENSAE is proposing when they're defending open approach, interdisciplinary approach, multiple approach, and talking to each other. Thank you.